Welcome to the Fact of Lounge podcast. I'm Dr. Sarah Gander, Associate Professor at Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick, and I'm your host for this podcast. Very pleased to welcome a friend and a colleague, Dr. Gary Bloch, who's from Toronto, Ontario. Maybe not from, but we'll find out, but living currently in Toronto, Ontario, and very well known, well respected for his work on social prescribing. So we're so excited to have him here today to talk about how it is important to have in our education and our faculty development about how we can include social prescribing and screening for the social determinants of health in our day-to-day practice, primary care, specialty care. I think we'll talk about it all. So welcome, Gary. Thanks for coming.
Super excited to be here.
So, it's always fun to talk about how I meet some of the people that have come on the podcast. And we were just talking about it before we started recording. And it kind of went like, I was fanning on you. Is that the right word? I was like, like, Gary Bloch's coming. You were like coming to a primary care talk, I think in like Moncton or Fredericton, or where were we?
I think it was Moncton.
And then I'm like, and I was also picking up an exam table for our new social peds clinic. And then I met you and I made you carry a table. And I'm sorry.
No, it was such a fabulous experience. It was with our other mutual friend, Linda Dalpy.
Yes. Who you need to help me get on the podcast. I've been begging her to come on and talk about rural medicine and career changes and wellness and that kind of stuff.
Oh my gosh, use this time for her. Are you kidding? Her stories are way better than mine.
Yeah, I go to this conference and I'm like, is that Gary Bloch? And then I'm like, I have your poverty tool there. And I'm like, will he sign it for me? And then I met you. And then, so we moved a table. And now I feel like I can cold call you to be on my podcast. So thank you.
Well, I kind of felt the same way. I mean, Sarah, you're one of the few people in the country that actually has a social medicine infrastructure set up, right? Which is actually very unusual. Like there's, in fact, a clinical social medicine infrastructure in this country is almost unheard of. Like it almost doesn't exist anywhere else. So to be fair, I was pretty excited to be there too.
It was like not totally my idea, right? Because Gilles Julien in Quebec is the pioneer. There's Sue Bennett in Vanier, but and Elaine Deschênes and Memram Cook. And then us here in St. John, we're very proud, which is why bringing you on to talk about your work, which has been going on for, a long time now. How old's the poverty tool?
So the poverty tool, I developed, I guess, around 2010 or so. But I've been doing work like this since I came into practice, which is, in fact, since I went into medical school, this is kind of where my thinking's been. So late 90s, really. Yeah, but this is a field that is always in such evolution, right? Always. It's just like every time I feel like I've gotten somewhere, I'm like, oh no, there's another horizon. It just shifted again. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's very exciting to be working in this world of social medicine, but it is really all encompassing. It's a bit overwhelming, right? The idea of, I think really what we're trying to do is like expand the scope of what medical care and what healthcare really is, right? So to move it beyond being a focus on the physical and a focus on mental health into being a focus on like real bio, psycho, and social care, right? And that is, in some ways, it feels like those traditional elements of healthcare are kind of, the tip of the mountain, the tip of the iceberg, and that what we're entering is all that stuff that kind of sits under the water and is holding all of it up. But it's never been boring. Over 20 plus years of doing this.
Well, it's crazy when you say I started this in 2010, you say, and then you're like, okay, that is 12 years ago. Because like when somebody says to me 20 years ago, I think, woo, in the 80s? And it's like, that was 40 years ago.
It's still the 2000s.
Well, we had a strategic plan with our board last night, and we quibbled over the word holistic. Mm-hmm. And did a whole sort of Urban Dictionary Wikipedia search of the word holistic, because one of my board members, because we were kind of talking about what does holistic mean and is that the right word, and when you look up the word holistic, it talks about rather than focusing on the parts, you focus on the whole.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, social medicine is about focusing on the whole, which as a pediatrician extends beyond children themselves and youth themselves, but of course the family unit, which as a primary care provider, may include the children of your patients or the spouse or what have you. And so I actually ended up really liking that word because it meant that more than wrap around, which feels like we're kind of doing it for people, I feel like holistic means we meet people where they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting word. I mean, for me, taking a sort of broader holistic approach really necessitates like an entirely different way of starting into our healthcare encounters, right? So, and I actually have talked more and more about this over the years. The idea that, we really need to start from just allowing people to tell their stories, giving space for people to tell their stories, and allowing those stories to kind of guide what comes next, right? And guide what our care will look like. I mean, certainly true in the family medicine world that I work in, which, is so, and then I think your world as well in social pediatrics, but so grounded just in people's lives, in their families, in their communities. And I think, I mean, what I've seen over the years is that every person has a different understanding of what health looks like for them, of what their support systems are like, of what has contributed to them being healthy or not, and what needs to be done. And I think a lot of the relearning that I do, and I think actually the relearning that my patients do as we enter into these encounters is sort of allowing all of us to sort of open up how we're going to approach our understanding of what healthcare is, right? And I see this most dramatically, I think, in the homeless service settings that I work in. Because I mean, I've worked in shelters and other homeless settings my entire career as well. And I think what I've come to see over time is that in order to engage with people who sit really on the most extreme social margins, like, and have been pushed out really to the most extreme social margins, we need to completely reconfigure like how we actually develop a relationship with each other, right? Because and that's largely the fault of the healthcare system because people, most people who've experienced homelessness for more than just a few months have had hard experiences in the healthcare system and so come in defensive and come in expecting me to, try and box them into certain stories and certain profiles. And, my first job there is usually just to kind of open that up and just to say, you know what? I'm actually here to start from your story and start from your understanding of what your health is. Right, and people have very different priorities than as I'm sure put forward very different priorities to what we are taught to put forward in medical school. Right? I mean, if someone's homeless, usually their first priority has something to do with getting housing and something to do with, finding enough money to feed themselves. Exactly. And maybe reconnecting with lost social supports and who knows, right? I mean, again, it's all different, but we really have to just open ourselves up to allowing those stories to guide what our care looks like. And I guess all that to circle back to the idea that to me is what really holistic or whole person or person-centered care needs to start from.
Yeah. What a beautiful phrase. Like, I'm here to start from your story. Like that.
Mhm.
I have all the feels for that. I'm like, where's a Post-it note? Write that down, Sarah. Where's your Sharpie? And that's why it's not boring. I mean, medicine is generally throws us for a loop every now and then, but how are we taught? We're taught to, put people into a box, a diagnostic criteria. This is what you do for this. This is what you do for that. And then, so we have like our ongoing populations that are, fairly predictable: homelessness, food insecurity. But then, then what was it, 6 or 7 years ago, an influx of Syrian refugees. And then now we're learning how to be culturally sensitive for, our Ukrainian population. And so there's always something new to learn and to consider. And sometimes there's common themes, like, I guess, trauma, but as if trauma is just, an entity and not a spectrum, or like we're learning so much about how, to deal with the adversity and adverse childhood experiences, but then the trauma out in the world for adults as well. And that it's not a one size fits all there either, of course. So when you first started doing this work early on, did you feel, because you're kind of a pioneer in this in Canada, I just want to tell you. So when you were doing that, where you're like, I'm going rogue, people aren't listening, people think I'm crazy, was it all the soft, like fuzzy stuff of medicine at that time?
When I started into this, I think I started with much more of kind of a big level activist bent, right? I was like, what I really want to do is social change work. I want to be involved in big activist movements and sort of, leverage my position in medicine to kind of support that. And got involved in a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, really sort of focused in on poverty at some point, for various reasons. But I think what I came to realize was that there were a couple things. I mean, first of all, there are limits what you can do as an activist individual, right? Even if you have a community around you and you're working with groups that are engaged in this work, I was like, social change has to happen on a bigger level than what we can do, sort of yelling and screaming and pointing out the problems of society. And that work is really important. I don't want to underplay the importance of that kind of work. But I really felt like we needed to start bigger movements towards change that were more broad based. And so, for me, first, that meant sort of working with the medical community and sort of thinking about how do we get these conversations happening in a normal way, an everyday way within the entire medical community and ideally the healthcare community in general. And that's where I sort of entered into more of kind of the education focused approaches and entered into sort of developing clinical tools like the poverty tool that you mentioned, which really were ways to just kind of weave this into the fabric of how we think of ourselves as clinicians, right? And as health providers, and had some success there and saw the stuff getting woven, like sort of built into medical curricula, and continuing faculty development curricula, and the colleges of family physicians at least started to pick this stuff up and develop educational sessions on it, et cetera, right? So it sort of built out that way. But, the next wave on that front to me was then really about, well, how can we then integrate this with the communities that we're working in, right? And sort of start interweaving what we do with community-led voices and community-led approaches to kind of engaging in this work. So, and that's, I think, very much kind of where my head's at now, is sort of what is the next phase of that. But I guess all that, I mean, again, this kind of comes back to what I said initially, which is that there's so much to learn here, and there's so much to sort of move forward. And like the new horizons in this work that keep opening up are only more exciting, but really broad and require continual just sort of thought and engagement and re-engagement with what it is we're trying to do. So, I mean, that was a very sort of long answer to your initial question of how I got into it.
Well,
But I
I
think
thought
it's
you were going to tell the
important
stories about your first times sort of at Queen's Park with the
yeah.
I picture the megaphone and and I don't mean to be flippant about it because it wasn't that long ago actually. But I think for
Yeah.
students who are listening and early career physicians, when they're just sort of dipping their toe in the big sort of pond of issues to be addressed, the courage to, like you say, use our privilege and our position to go out there and say, I'm putting up a tent and I'm prescribing income to people, and people are saying, well, what does that even look like? What are you even talking about? But even just the optics of sending home that very important message that money in people's pockets directly impact their health, then, I mean, that was a really powerful change in our social medicine movement, I think, in Canada.
Yeah, and it was very eye-opening, right? I mean, and so, like, briefly, what that story is that, in those kind of activist poverty days, a group of us basically got called in by, what was seen as like a very radical anti-poverty organization, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, uh, to basically support them in running clinics to help people on social assistance access extra funds through something called a special diet program, which basically, if you declared that someone needed extra money for special dietary needs, they could get up to $250 a month in extra money, which is a huge amount for someone living on social assistance. Total game changer. And we kind of made a decision. This is like 2005. We made a decision to essentially just diagnose people with poverty, right? And just say, look, these people all have special dietary needs because they're living in extreme deep poverty, right? And they were getting, I don't know, it's like $560 a month from social assistance or something in Ontario at that point. Like, we ran these clinics, they were in the community, people came, there was obviously huge excitement, they got bigger, then we ran a huge clinic on the lawns of, like, the provincial legislature, Queen's Park, and I mean, obviously the government shut us down and changed the rules. I mean, that's no huge surprise, right? And, said we were stepping, way out of our lanes and doing this kind of work, et cetera, et cetera. But it really was, I mean, it was exciting because we saw a really fast and just energetic mobilization of health providers around this to support this. So we suddenly, we moved from like a small group of us to like about 80 or so health providers that got involved directly in this frontline direct action. But it also really kind of triggered this idea or this sort of sense in me that, if we could find ways to make health providers feel like they could use their core skills, right, of diagnosing and prescribing essentially, that would sort of somehow fit this work much more deeply into the typical kind of healthcare mindset than the more kind of esoteric sort of policy or activist or advocacy focused work tends to do. And that's also, I guess, where a lot of that sort of focus on, you know, deeper work to embed this stuff in curriculum and clinical practice really came from.
Well, I think it's genius because the biggest
Yeah.
criticism we get with social medicine is like, well, we're not social workers. We're, there's good people with good educations that are meant to be kind of doing these things. And I want to go back to what you said about, stay in your own lane kind of mentality. And even though the CanMeds roles, when you think of the Royal College and stuff, promotes the advocacy piece and that sort of thing, that's why I'm interested in these conversations on this podcast, is because that functionality of how that fits into our day-to-day scope, I think, is probably the bigger challenge than finding people who have passion or who have issues that they care about. We have a member of our community in the faculty here who's just very passionate about electric cars from a planetary health perspective. And, I follow her on Facebook. Sorry, I won't say her name because I won't call her out. But, I'm always so captivated by how her message is clear and consistent. And she has an electric car and she takes pictures of her car and she tells people about the rebates. And it's just, so I think that there are people who have their passions and stuff. Now she's doing that in her private life. But how do you bring it into your lane? And how do we teach students that, do we have a lane, or are we meant to swerve into other lanes sometimes? And unless we do that, maybe those are the cracks that people are falling through, for example. So there's some sort of metaphor there that.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we have to sort of, those are really good questions, right? I mean, what is this lane, right? How do we define it? How do we justify it? Right? Is this a lane that's right next door? Is this a lane that's like, off an off ramp somewhere? I would argue that it's right beside us, and I think the evidence supports that. And I think that, I also think there's 150, 200 years of pretty steady conversation within the healthcare world about the need to include action on social determinants within healthcare practice, within our just conceptualization and understanding of health. But yeah, I mean, I love the lane analogy. In some ways, it's like the medical institutions can be like those lane deviation warnings like cars have now, where they beep at you every time you shift over. And sometimes they even like force your car back until you like force it over. So, but I think we got to turn off those beeping warnings and just make this.
One time when I was working with that analogy, I was like, yeah, I've hit those bumpy bits on the side of the road and I've ignored them and gone right into the ditch.
That's right.
On purpose.
Exactly.
Because for my patients, they need somebody to get down in the ditch with them, I guess, and try to lift them out and try to support them to learn how to drive, and then maybe they can get their own car and keep going, sort of thing, in their own lane. But yeah, and so I love that we want to teach students about their lane, when you can go into another lane, but also respecting the other positions that people are in, and then working in a synergy, because, this can be overwhelming work. This can be, there's vicarious trauma that, we experience as all physicians, but people working in social medicine too. And so learning how to do this work and being able to sustain yourself, I think too, is something that our faculty would probably like to hear about. I don't know how you keep yourself well with all of this.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of pieces to that, right? So I mean, it was a huge step forward for CanMes to include advocacy as one of its main competencies, right? I mean, it needed to be there. Like, there's no question. No one's knew quite what to do with it. I think it's still very much in the process of being defined. But I think it speaks to the fact that we're sort of weaving this work closer, again, to our central conception of what we do. But it also, like that, I mean, being at that level of conversation reminds me that we need to sort of keep ourselves both on the margins of healthcare practice, in the sense of like pushing not marginalized, but sort of pushing the boundaries of what healthcare practice looks like. But we also need to keep ourselves at the center, right? And I think part of the power of being, especially physicians, like not necessarily all healthcare providers, but especially physicians doing this work, is that we bring a really important just set of professional privilege and cachet and power um, into conversations about social change. And you don't have to hang on to that. Not all activist physicians do hang on to that. I try to walk a line of sort of keeping on the right side of what we often call professionalism, because I think it sort of adds to the power of our voice on these issues of change.
Yeah, like find the edge, but at the same time, it's that balance between asking for forgiveness and asking for permission, because
right.
I want to find the edge and then bring that closer to the mainstream and then go find the next edge.
Exactly.
And if you just go rogue all the time and are like that, wild, not following the rules person, you won't have the same measure of integrity or buy-in.
Yeah, and I don't want to in any way discount the power of the people who really push boundaries hard, right? I mean, I look to those people, right, to say, okay, they're the ones, like the sort of real radicals who are showing me where we need to go. But then I also like to think, okay, I want to sit somewhere in between so that I'm able to sort of pull the center over a little bit. Anyway, I mean, and that's that's a lot to say in one sentence, and I think there's a whole conversation we can have about what that means strategically. But just, I think for the purpose of this conversation, what I would say is that there are many very legitimate ways to do this type of work, right? Of sort of pushing social medicine, none of which should be discounted, none of which should be undervalued, right? And it may come through small shifts in clinical practice. It may come through developing curriculum. It may come through again, like big level advocacy and social policy work, and who knows, right? I mean, there's just, and all of that is valuable, and all of that plays into a whole. And I guess sort of coming around to the kind of wellness piece of that. Sorry, the wellness piece of that. Um, it's the I don't have an easy answer to that, other than I always try and keep an eye on my own wellness. I mean, look, I have 3 kids, right? I mean, they're all teenagers right now. I mean, the oldest is 16, and so for 16 years, I mean, they have demanded a massive amount of me, right? And my attention, and I have happily, and will continue to happily give them that. And I got to say that as my time as a parent goes on, I've sort of hived off and protected more and more time for just home life and family, and just making sure that that balance is there, right? And I think I think I would burn out very quickly if I didn't do that. So there've been a couple of things that have helped me do that. One is sort of narrowing somewhat the focus of what it is that I focus in on. I mean, I said earlier that, like, when I started out, I was sort of focused on every issue, right? Like social change on every front. And then, well, right, but cure not just poverty, but cure, like, I mean, it was like I was involved in LGBT rights and women's rights and poverty rights and refugee rights, and you name it. It's like everything that came across, I was happy to kind of jump in there. And actually sort of honing in on this sort of, I mean, relatively narrow idea of, like, dealing with poverty in frontline care was one way of sort of avoiding the kind of really broad activist burnout that I kind of felt coming on, right? Where I was like, okay, I'm going to set a goal here. I'm going to set a goal that's narrow. It means saying no, right? It means sort of pushing away some of the other things I've been working on and interested in, but it also means allowing myself to just really go deep into one focus and one issue. I mean, poverty is a broad ranging issue, but some would argue that it's too narrow, right? It doesn't allow for the big conversations around intersectionality and the huge breadth of social forces that are playing in. But I will say that, I mean, this is now probably 15 years or more since I made that choice. The conversation's kind of broadening out again, right? So it's like we've had some success in bringing action on poverty into the mainstream of how we see ourselves as clinicians. We're now able to kind of build on that and talk about those other issues, right? And, like, we're now going really deeply into things like, anti-Black racism and Indigenous reconciliation and, you know, and intersection, like, and really sort of getting or allowing more complex conversations about what addressing the social foundations of health really means. Um, but all that to say that I think that strategy for me was partly a self-preservation strategy, and I think it was successful. I feel pretty happy with how
Well,
things
I
are,
wonder. I wondered if that
you
was
know?
true, and that's why I kind of put those two
Yeah.
concepts together, although they didn't maybe seem as intuitive. And I think maybe that's because it's somewhat true for me, and how as faculty we can coach and model students for their interest is a, you sort of said, keeping on that sort of edge, but somewhere in between, to kind of in the, I don't know, I don't want to say mainstream, but just, maintaining those professional boundaries, I think is something that we can model and teach students, because students are so passionate.
Yeah.
There's lots of studies that show that our students haven't necessarily reconciled their personal and professional identities, whether that be on social media. So I think coaching our students on how to appropriately use their voice, whether that be in person or be online or what have you, it's very easy to sort of, throw out a defund the whatever, and, that follows you throughout your career. And so how can we kind of, coach them to not to be effective, but also be able to maintain their career going forward. And then so they can focus and can be well. Because I think those are the things that really impact wellness. Like I was saying before we came on, is that when I was talking about masks in school recently, it was the first time I had really received, the trolley hate comments. And like I'm at a stage in my life where that doesn't really faze me too much, but how are we coaching students to be able to not necessarily react to that, to understand that there are differences of opinion, to understand that we still have to treat those patients and understand that lens. But then at the same time, when they're honing in on their focus of what they want to be passionate about, how can we coach them and help them to understand that you don't have to take on the whole world, that you can be very effective. Like my example with my friend with the electric car. I want to buy an electric car because she won't stop talking about it, and it's the simplest little thing, but it's just so effective when you're dialed in, and then you've created a foundation that you can build from, which really, so the poverty tool, for those of you who don't know who are listening, is, I don't want to oversimplify it, Gary, but it's as simple as building into your repertoire of questions. Do you have difficulty making ends meet? And like the researcher in me loves that it has, it has its sensitivity and specificity. And then if they say, yes, this is what you can do. And that can be different in each province, or it can be, and I can put a link in the show notes about how to get the poverty and use the poverty tool, because it's fantastic. But my point is that now we have a whole foundation for social prescribing. And you were a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, and that foundation's been building from many angles, right? So the poverty tool was, I mean, it is simple, right? That's all it was intended to be, was something that was very simple. It was intended to be a conversation starter. It was intended to support educational work and sort of, allow people to sort of boil down really complex topics to something they could relate to. Um, it's certainly so sure. I mean, I think I do think it had a role to play in helping shift the conversation. I think a lot has happened in our society that's had roles to play in shifting the conversation, right?
Well,
And I
I mean,
think that
even just my time in the Canadian Pediatric Society
yeah,
world, prescribing books, prescribing physical activity, in New Brunswick, they just announced that we are able to prescribe passes to our national parks. So there's that whole movement around sort of being outside and being in nature, and how that's part of a wellness strategy. But I think what your work with the poverty tool did, and what we can offer students as faculty, is that it is part of our job to ask those questions and to operationalize that. Like, it gave us the words to use where it was kind of fuzzy before, like, do you have enough money, or like, what, all of a sudden it was like, do you have trouble making ends meet? We could just keep saying that, and if somebody said yes, then you felt like you could do something about that.
right.
And that's hard for people who aren't as familiar with social medicine. It's like, if I ask those questions, if I teach somebody to ask those questions, then I'm gonna have to do something about it.
No, that's right. So that, I mean, the tool offers some very simple interventions, right? And I mean, I guess my hope with that was always that it would serve as sort of a thin edge of a wedge, right? That it would insert a little bit of action on this front into frontline care, and then open the door even just a crack, right? To allow us to sort of explore these other types of interventions. And it's actually amazing. I mean, we just published this article, sort of this overview of social interventions in primary care. And I did the first kind of round of lit review for that probably about 4 years ago now, right? So like maybe, yeah, 3, 4 years ago, like a year and a bit before the pandemic. And then it kind of sat there and I have time to deal with it. And so I came back to it, about a year and a half later. And it's like the amount of literature that had been published in the intervening year and a half was like astounding, right? I was just like, oh my God. Right. Well, I was right. So I was totally, oh crap. But I was also like, there's a wave happening here, right? Like, it's actually just, I mean, I should have gotten the article out before because it would have made my life easier, but there was actually a lot of amazing stuff that had just rolled over the edge suddenly, and we're still in it, right? And we're in it even more, and, only pushed forward by, like, Black Lives Matter and, all the other movements that are kinda driving conversations around equity in society in general. Um, and so, in many ways, I feel like I'm now scrambling just to catch up, where I'm like, and I see this, I see that, like, the people coming into and out of medical school now are so sophisticated on these issues in ways that I mean, I thought I was sophisticated, right? Like, I mean, my first degree was in colonial history, right? It's like I thought about this stuff coming in, right? It's like, but honestly, I mean, the sort of level of discourse now is so far beyond, what I knew in the late '90s going into medical school that it's amazing, and, I mean, that's good. Like, that's what we want, and it's sort of, that is totally what we're after, right? And so now I'm just sort of turning around and saying, "Okay, I'm following you guys."
No, it's so true. It's funny that you went there because I was kind of going there in my mind.
Yeah.
Just for the audience, and it'll be in the show notes. That's your CMAJ December 2021 edition, with Gary's article, Implementing Social Interventions in Primary Care, which was a great article and summary about, and some practical tips about how to put that into your practice. Some of the challenges, too, I think it lays out. And so there's still work to be done, but maybe that's the beauty of watching the students who come in now, who largely teach us, about some of these things. And a lot of those things are their own, like, lived experience and, like, first voice of oppression or racism or, and we're always working towards, well, at Dalhousie, we're very deliberate in how we are looking at our admission criteria to represent, the true population of the nation, and our areas in particular.
Yeah, and I mean, not to hang on to that article for too long, but it's like, what was interesting to me there is that there's, I mean, the article kind of goes through, like, a bunch of, like, poverty interventions and employment and, literacy, like the stuff you'd sort of expect. But then we get to this one section that's called equity oriented practice change, right? Which is probably the sort of least explored area in the literature in some ways, but I think, and then the literature always lags behind what everyone's doing, right? But that's actually the area that speaks to where I think this stuff is going, right? That it's going from, and not that we're going to leave everything behind, but going from this idea of kind of like hard interventions into social determinants of health, where we try and shift people's housing and poverty, blah, 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 into saying, okay, we really want to look at ways to make structural change, right? Within our institutions and within our groups and within ourselves, actually, on a really deep level. And then hoping that that starts to reflect the kind of structural shifts that need to happen to really start seeing equity oriented shifts in health services and ultimately in health outcomes. Right. And that's really deep work, right? I mean, that is like, I mean, as an example, I mean, we started an anti-racism working group in our department probably 5 years ago now. Um, and I still feel we're at the beginning. Like, we've done a lot of work, right? We have huge buy-in from our team, from our leadership. We've brought in consultants. We've done educational sessions. We spent a lot of time talking about this. It's been painful, and we've been through, which it has to be. And we're just starting, like, I feel like, again, we're just starting to really get into an understanding of what it means to build an anti-racist approach into a healthcare team, right? And so that's the kind of work which actually I think that people who are in medical school or recently out really get, right? I mean, this is like, this is the new wave.
And
It's
that
like,
they want to create teams and start with teams that are already doing
yeah,
that work, rather than finding that 20 years down the road you need to unlearn or, like, create complete new neural pathways.
that's right. Yeah, can you build an anti-oppressive approach into the foundational structures of what your teams look like, right? And can you rebuild your institutions to have those types of approaches,
Well, I hope
right?
our students demand that because
Yeah.
honestly, well, I think we count on them to do that, which puts a lot of pressure on them probably in a lot of ways because, like I said, we are learning a lot. But what I've noticed with students, which is really fascinating to me, because I do a little bit of a few talks on like teaching millennials, even though, just because it's a different generation and population than like you and I are, and then the generation that came before us. But what's fascinating to me is how students will call you out. And
Hmm.
like, I love it because I want to, you want to be called out. And if you're somebody who's open and wanting to learn, and they'll sort of say, whatever, I can't even think of an example right now. But I think we also, how are we coaching students to use that passion, experience, and like contribution, which is so needed and so wanted by many, but balance the fact that they're inherently in a vulnerable position because they're students and they count on us for reference letters and evaluations and assessments. So, like, it might not go over so well if somebody calls them out on, hey, you can learn to pronounce my name. You don't have to call me hey, you across the room, or, whatever the circumstance is. I don't know.
Yeah.
How are
And
we doing
it's,
that?
yeah, I mean, it
Am I asking too many tough questions? We could talk
no, no,
about
no,
something
it's a
lighter
really
too.
good, it's a really good question. I guess, and I don't have answers to any of this stuff, right? I mean, this is all really hard stuff, but there's a couple things. I mean, look, we were also doing this when I was in medical school. We were also really calling out the institution and trying to shift things and doing all this. And
Well, that's
I'm
the irony
really
is
happy
that we
that's.
think that the millennials are going rogue, but then you like look at the 70s and you're like, no,
Oh
no.
yeah,
Like there was
no,
lots of
totally.
anti-establishment
Oh yeah, no,
situations
we were
happening.
raising shit all over the place when it came to like curriculum and what the structures that we were working in. Um, yeah, I think there's a couple things that helped me. First of all, just fostering communities of support among students. So people, there were times for me, I mean, especially earlier on in medical school, where I was like, is there anyone else that thinks the way that I do? And I met those people, obviously. I mean, they were there, and you find your people, and you find it among the students, and you find it among the faculty, right? I mean, so to build the kind of mentorship supports and the kind of on the ground community really, I think helps you feel protected. Um, but then beyond that, I think to see institutions, and they are doing this, but more and more need to sort of build uh, really sort of obvious, like upfront institutional supports around this work. So, like, I know, I mean, at my institution at U of T, uh, we now have leads in equity and social accountability and Black health and Indigenous health, um, amongst others, right? I mean, it's like these people are, and most of these leads tend to be uh, sort of younger, very progressive faculty who are excited to work with the institution, but also are willing to kind of push the institution, willing to kind of speak their truth to the power of the institution they're working in, and I think have become really important supports for students. And I know there's a lot of crosstalk between these leads and the student body, and some of that's painful, right? Some of that involves a real back and forth, and sometimes it puts these faculty leads into tough positions, right, where they feel like they are defending an institution that they've been battling against for a long time. But also, I think learning how to navigate what that change process looks like and serving as a bit of a buffer and a buffer for students to be able to kind of come out as being socially progressive and put themselves forward in that way.
Yeah, and the
So
accreditation
it's
process
it's
has
it's
even like had social accountability be part of sort of a deliverable, which is nice, which I think
yeah.
we've seen evolve over the last couple of years with Dal calls it service-based learning. It's a non-mandatory opportunity to kind of align with a community organization and sort of have that experience and do a project and stuff. And I don't know how you make these things mandatory, and I think about it the opposite way, where it's like, how can we, I like your word of weaving through, if you're having your problem list of the patients that you're seeing, Like
Mhm.
it's their diabetes care, it's their cardiovascular disease, it's their, lack of, pharmaceutical coverage, it's their poverty or their, three guys living in a room because that's all they can afford sort of thing.
Mhm.
That part of the problem list, is equally as important, or like how do we teach how like arguably nothing matters unless they can pay for the medications that you're prescribing sort of thing,
Right.
or like
Right.
nothing
And
matters unless they have a fridge to put that prescription in or whatever. I think of fridges because pediatric patients usually, insulin or whatever needs a fridge, but you know or like with family planning, if you don't have a bedside table to put your birth control pill in, you're probably not going to remember to take it sort of thing is what we say. So how can we make that problem list be, so I don't like to other the social accountability piece of
wow.
like you can do this maybe if you kind of want to. And I'm not criticizing because I think they're just trying to build it in because the curriculum's so thick with the demands of all the things. But I love that the cases now and that stuff, how can we build into cases? It's not just, the gay man who has HIV, but it's like actually, the two dads who have a baby who's born prematurely. It actually has nothing to do with the fact that it's two dads. It's not the red, that's not the
Yep.
clue anymore.
No, that's right. Yeah, and that's been a huge movement. I mean, when I came to medical school, we were the 2nd year of what we then called problem-based learning, which I don't think it's called anymore, right? But this idea
We
of, like,
are
just
that
sort of
old.
case-based learning. Yeah, no, really. And we literally was, the gay man with HIV. Like, that's really, and there was literally explicit questions around, in that case, let's talk a little bit about, the gay community, and that's kind of where it came in. That's definitely shifted, right? I mean, there's definitely been, it's not
Yeah, the
perfect.
indigenous person with diabetes. It's like, well, actually,
Yeah, no, exactly,
that's
right?
not the only
So,
thing that comes up.
yeah, and that's a sign again of just sort of everyone becoming more sophisticated in these conversations, right? But, it actually, I mean, it speaks to another bit of that wellness question of the fact that it's taken, what are we at? Like 20 to 25 years from the beginning of case-based learning to really see that weave its way in. And that's okay, right? Looking back, that feels okay. Sure, I would have loved for it to happen faster, but that is how things move in this world.
And that it's a
And maybe
marathon, not
that's,
a sprint sort of thing.
it's a marathon, not a sprint. And honestly, as you go through it, you celebrate the small changes that happen more quickly, and then you look back on the bigger changes and you're like, wow, things really have shifted, but they, on that level, they shifted in ways that were, like a glacier moving in some degree, where you look back and you're like, okay, it moved. It actually
I
moved.
would argue that in social medicine, like there's the work that you and I do, I'm going to pull out the macro, meso, micro words,
Yeah.
but like there's those big structural changes like, housing.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing more difficult right now for us in New Brunswick than housing, or probably across the country. And so then you're like, there's that big stuff. Then there's sort of that like, how do I work with our local housing, groups? And then there's like the patients. I'm staring at the HEPA filter I have in my office right now to deliver later this afternoon for a family. It's like that micro stuff. So when I go into that apartment and I mean, people might be rolling their eyes. Like, it was one of my research programs that bought this. I didn't buy it personally, but like, we have a plan for how we support people for that extra.
Yeah.
And when you go in there and then that child doesn't have an admission for asthma for the next couple of months, that's the stuff that keeps me going. Not the fact that in my lifetime I'm ever going to see the end to the housing problem.
And that's so important, right? I mean, right, for me, I've always been grounded by my clinical work, right? I mean, I've sort of sworn that I will never go below, like, I don't know, half time, 60% of my time doing clinical work, 'cause that is where you see the real impacts of change on a day-to-day basis, and also where you feel like, you're still out there working in communities and sort of in touch with what real day-to-day life feels like, and really using the full breadth of our skills. Well, of course. Well, right. So it informs the change. And it also speaks to, I think, the other big movement that's happening, which is about bringing community voices into the sort of conceptualization and planning of this work, which has been, um, I'd say over the last 5 or 6 years, one of the most transformative things that's happened
Yeah,
in
like
the
we don't
world
know
of
what's best for you,
medicine.
you know it's best for you.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And sort of having really powerful voices of lived experience, like experts with lived experience at our tables. And it takes a while to get to this, but I think that in at least some of the spaces I'm in, those lived experience experts feel more and more comfortable calling out what we do.
Yeah. Which
Um,
is where a lot of the work is, not
yeah,
the balance between kind of tokenizing those people. I don't mean to say those people, if that's even nasty for me to say, but, like creating the space, holding the space,
yeah,
making the time that it takes to get comfortable and not being, because I think that we put people on our schedule too. Okay, now we need to get this done by, and you don't
yeah,
know when the trust is going to be built, and you don't know, and it might not ever be.
right.
What a beautiful full circle, Gary, to the beginning of our podcast, which was about stories.
Hmm.
Don't you think it's our obligation to create the space for those stories, whether it be in cases in education, whether it be in policy change, and like we get the blessing and the privilege of hearing people's stories every day.
We do. Yeah, hearing them and listening, like really listening to those stories and allowing, not even just allowing those stories to sort of uh, to push us towards making change, but sort of putting those stories at the center of what change will look like in our worlds. Yeah, I often use this quote from this pediatrician actually in New York, Sayantani Dasgupta, who talks about hearing stories and really says that listening to stories in itself is an act of social justice, right? And I really, really do hold on to that as a guide.
I love that. One of our sort of wonderful humans in the pediatric world in Canada is Lee Ford Jones. And she lost her husband Anthony this year. And when I sent her a note, and she wrote me back and said, Anthony always had time for the person who was in front of him, no tension and no rush. And I
Wow.
just thought, like, I was just sending you a note to say I'm sorry, and you like taught me something else. Like, oh my gosh. So I just think, yeah, like listening, trying, yeah, that's the work of our lives.
Hmm. It really is.
Wonderful. Gary, thanks for coming and having this conversation and for the work you do and for the beautiful publications that I'm rattling here that it's all like all the papers like bent from my bathwater because that's where I read articles. I go home and I lock the door so my kids leave me alone and I get to read the things from start to finish that I want to read. So
I
thank you
love
for
it.
all you do and your friendship and I just love knowing you.
Thanks, Sarah. It's been so fun.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Fact Dev Lounge podcast. Please leave us a review on iTunes, YouTube, or SoundCloud, and even a comment on some ideas for future podcasts. Thank you very much and have a great day.